I want to welcome everyone to celebration of the life of an artist. We're celebrating Marcia Brown. My name is Brian Keogh. I'm head of Special Collections and Archives at the University of Albany, and I want to welcome you all to this wonderful event. We have a number of speakers in our program, and what we're going to try to do today is try to go through Marcia's life through each of our speakers. We're going to go chronologically. They're going to talk about different aspects of Marcia's life. Her experience here at this institution as a college student, her experience at the New York Public Library, her work, obviously all her books, her publications. We're going to hear from people who were neighbors with Marcia in Connecticut, talking about some of the personal things that Marcia liked to do. We're going to look at how the wonderful collection of all of Marcia's original artwork for every one of the books that she illustrated, published, or translated, all that original artwork, pre-work, post-work, is all here in the collection. And my predecessor, who packed up the collection at Marcia's house in Connecticut, is going to tell us all about that. And then we're going to hear some really interesting talks about why do we keep historical children's literature? Why are we keeping this? Why don't we just read all the new stuff? We're going to hear about how important children's literature is to the study of history, and also how historians use children's books as primary sources. And we're going to end the program today with, which I'm really excited about, is our keynote speaker, Anita Silvey, former editor of the Horn Book, author of a number of books, most recently about Jane Goodall. And I learned today that in August she'll be coming out with a book for young adults?
Yeah, 5th, 6th grade.
5th, 6th grade,
Yeah.
about one of my favorite persons ever, Pete Seeger. So really looking forward to that. Before we get started with the formal part of the program, I want to just acknowledge a couple people, all of my staff in Special Collections, Mark Wolf, Jody Boyle, Greg Wiedemann, Melissa McMullen. Our graduate students have really helped me look good in putting this together. Put the exhibit out there, did all the housekeeping kinds of things, so I want to really thank all of them publicly. I also want to recognize the School of Education here at the university, which is sponsoring this program, and we're going to hear from a professor in the school very shortly. And I think that's all the people I want to acknowledge at this time. But first, let me bring up Rebecca Mugridge, who's the interim dean of the libraries.
Welcome to this very special event to honor and celebrate the life of Marcia Brown, an award-winning author and illustrator and a graduate of the University at Albany, back when it was still known as the New York State College of Teachers. We're honoring Miss Brown not only because of her accomplishments, but also because she was a lifelong friend of the university and the libraries. She has given generously to the libraries over the years, including artwork that you will see displayed down the hall in the Special Collections and Archives. While you're here, I hope you have a chance to visit the Science Library downstairs or the University Library across the podium. We have an excellent program ahead of us, and I'm sure you'll enjoy every bit of it. So thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. And Ginny Goatley is going to come and welcome the School of Education. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I share a few words on behalf of the School of Education and Dean Bob Banker-Drowns, who's out of town at an educational conference today. My name's Ginny Goatley. I'm a professor and I'm chair of the Department of Literacy, Teaching, and Learning in the School of Education. As many of you know, Marcia Brown earned a bachelor's degree in English and Drama from the New York State College for Teachers in 1940, a forerunner to the University at Albany and a precursor to our current School of Education, which today still awards degrees for teacher certification in English. In addition, we have a large and well-known program for certification of literacy specialists, those who teach children and young adults to read and write, both within schools and in the larger community. In this program, Marcia Brown's legacy certainly lives on, where teachers and doctoral students learn about her books and how they have been used in school settings, as well as how she has helped all of us to value literature in new and expansive ways. In the last couple of weeks, I thought about all the ways Marcia Brown has impacted our education profession and our lives. To give you a better sense of the impact of her work, I share my own educational journey to provide an example. As a child, I remember my mother reading Marcia's books to me, as did the local librarians during library hour. Books such as Once a Mouse, Felice, and Three Billy Goats Gruff. As a teenager, I worked for 4 years in a community library, regularly recommending the new publication at the time, Shadow, to the children seeking a book to read. As an undergraduate in a teacher preparation program at Michigan State University, our professor, Pat Cianciola, who was routinely on the Caldecott selection committee, exposed me to even more of Marcia's books, sharing her insights into the illustrations and historical importance of books such as All Butterflies ABC and Dick Whittington and His Cat. In my student teaching experience, we engaged young children in comparisons of the Cinderella stories, with Marcia Brown's version a prominent component of this activity. As a first grade teacher, the children in my school had a magical experience in which they created their own stone soup to consider the concepts of hunger, sharing, and community, an activity still used in numerous early elementary classrooms. As a teacher educator, I introduced our graduate students to how the ostrich got its long neck and encouraged them to consider the illustrations carefully. Like many other educators of my generation, Marcia Brown's influence and impact is intertwined with our own histories. Marcia Brown's legacy lives on in many ways. Our School of Education today continues an extraordinary tradition of excellence that began with the founding of the New York State Normal School in 1844. We continue to offer teacher certification programs in English for secondary teachers. With expertise in many areas, the School of Education is much different now than it was in 1940. Now a place in which faculty and students discover and disseminate new knowledge in all facets of education, from mental health, informational technology, literacy development, global education, comparative policy, technology, software design, and school administration. We have an enormous impact on schools and education professionals in the capital region, New York State, and around the world. But just to share a little example with you, last week during a School of Education faculty meeting, the dean reminded faculty about this Marcia Brown event today. Even with this wide and growing range of expertise in our faculty, many heads in the room nodded with respect and recognition for Marcia Brown and her legacy. We are honored that our early roots as the school, as a college for teachers, included Marcia Brown, a woman who impacted so many children's, parents, and educators in so many important ways. We thank you all for coming, and I am so honored to be here and learn all I can from all of you today as well.
Thank you so much. So the first speaker we're going to bring up today is going to look at Marcia's college undergraduate experience here at the New York State College of Teachers. And it highlights one of the things that this school, it's in its early tradition, and one of the things I really love about this institution is this institution always gave opportunities for higher education to people who came from families that didn't have a lot of money. And it's still like that today. It was like that when Marcia came here. It's been like that since December 1844 when we had the first class here. We were the first public school of higher education in New York State, the first public higher education school to offer a bachelor's degree in the early 20th century. The school, from World War I up until about 1960, when we became a research university, was not only a college for teachers, it was a vibrant and robust liberal arts school, a small liberal arts school where everyone knew each other. There were maybe 1,000 students. There was a rigorous liberal arts program, what you'd find at maybe a private liberal arts school. It was a place where people who could get into Yale but couldn't afford to go to Yale, they came here. And it was a really great thing. Marcia grew up, born in Rochester, New York. Her father was a minister, traveled to different places in upstate New York. In her teenage years, she lived in Kingston, New York, and her parents cultivated this love for reading, for art, for music that stayed with Marcia for her entire life. And so Marcia came here in the fall of 1936, New York State College for Teachers, and I want to introduce Greg Wiedemann, who's the university archivist. He started 1 year and 1 day ago today. This is his 366th day as University Archivist. So we're so proud to have him here and come tell us about what was it like for Marcia as an undergraduate from 1936 to 1940. We're going to find out. Good.
Well, thank you, Brian. Like he said, I'm Greg Wiedemann. So as the University Archivist, I manage the historic records in the university here at SUNY Albany. And I'm going to tell you about Marcia Brown's experience at the State College of Teachers in the 1930s. Now, she didn't go to school on this campus. This campus was a golf course. She went to school on what we now call the downtown campus. In 1939, it was called the State College for Teachers. And it began as a teacher's training school in the 1940s. Prior to that period, education in this country was kind of underdeveloped. Basically, if you were intelligent and you had access to books, which were very expensive, you were a teacher. And oftentimes, education was used as a means of advancement. You would teach for a couple years, then move on to law school or a profession of your choice. This is the same type of period where Noah Webster standardized spelling by publishing a couple textbooks. Jedediah Morse taught 2 generations of Americans geography in the late 18th and early 19th century just by publishing a couple textbooks. And Jedediah Morse was a Congregationalist minister and the father of Samuel Morse, who invented the telegraph and painted this picture of his father. And like Marcia Brown's father, he was a minister. And Jedediah Morse and Samuel Morse were wealthy enough to go to Yale. But like Brian said, in that period, if you weren't wealthy enough to go to Yale, there wasn't really that formal means of advancement until the 1940s and the establishment of normal schools. Now, normal schools taught norms or standards that teachers would later go on and teach their pupils. The downtown campus here was built in 1909, and then it was called the State Normal College in that period. And this is the State College for Teachers, which changed its name to in 1915 when it adopted a broad liberal arts educational background. So this is the State College of Teachers as in Martha's era. And this is while she was at school, so theoretically she could have been on this campus while this picture was taken. Over on the left, you can see Albany High School is the large building on the left. And right next to it is the Milne School. Now before teachers had student teaching at different school districts, the college hosted a high school on this campus at the Milne School, and that's where teachers in training would go teach and learn how to teach. So you could see the campus was very connected to education in this period, quite literally. When Marcia came here, she lived in Pierce Hall, which is an alumni campus down at the corner of Ontario Street and Western today. It wasn't called Pierce Hall in that era. It was actually called the Alumni Dorm, because it wasn't actually owned by and operated by the university. She lived on the 2nd story here. But actually, in that period, they built dorms by raising money through the Alumni Association. And the Alumni Association owned and operated these facilities. And sort of the forefront of building these dorms, particularly a women's dorm, was Anna Pierce, who was the Dean of Women up until 1933. And she was a prolific author of tracts about how the students needed safe spaces, and they needed particularly a house mother to manage their social structure while they were their time here. And that's who Pierce Hall would later be named. And this is a good example, is one of the reasons that she advocated for a women's dorm is that a hollow-chested and underweight girl had trouble breathing. So the doctor advised her to sleep with the windows open, but her landlady at that time would not heat the building with the windows open. So the doctor had to send her home until the State College had a dormitory. And I love the last line. So a hollow-chested girl could breathe properly and get enough of the cheapest commodity in the world, fresh air. So Anna Pierce was a big proponent of this idea called in loco parentis, which means essentially in lieu of parents. So in that time, like I said, she needed sort of these regulations to give them the foundation to succeed in school. And this is the Pierce Hall dining room, then called the Alumni Dorm, in Marcia's time. So, and these are some of the regulations that are outlined in the student handbook, that much like one that was given to Marcia Brown in 1936. As you can see, the first paragraph here, it says it expects each student to hold themselves to dignified living, etc., and good conduct. Yet it goes on for a couple more pages, where the following regulations shall govern all women students whose scholarly record is satisfactory. Essentially, the men only had to follow the first paragraph. The women had a couple of paragraphs of which to follow. One of which were here. Of course, dances were the potential for some lewd behavior. So they had curfews after each dance where they had to be back in their dorms. And even on other campuses, they had to ascertain the closing time of the dance before they left and had to be back in their dorms an hour afterwards. And this is a dance at Hawley Hall in 1940 during Marcia's era. And this is now the Dewey Library on the downtown campus. When students were living in houses where there were 3 or more resident students, they had to register absences during hours and overnight. And these records should be subject to inspection at any time by the office of the Residence Council and the Dean of Women. So they had to register every time they didn't spend their nights in their own dorms. And this wasn't even the college dorms. This was even if you were a private boarder living in some place in Albany. And this is the first floor of Pierce Hall during Marcia's freshman year, actually. This is another picture of Pierce Hall. And this shows that after each dance, the house mother or the house president can personally come by and inspect that you had returned to your room. And you had to sign a sheet saying so. For the men, they weren't allowed upstairs. They were confined for the first floor of all of the women's dorms. And of course, no women students may visit a men's house or boarding house at any time unless adequate chaperonage is assured. And this is Sales Hall, which is next door, which was built 2 years after Marcia left. If you notice, the women got these white columns in the first floor, where the men got knotty pine interiors. So Marcia, when she was here, also excelled academically. She was an exceptional student at Kingston High School, taking history, Latin, French, and English. And I found it notable on her incoming transcript that coursework in bookkeeping, shorthand, and typewriting were blank, yet design, theater, voice training, and glee club had to be written in. She was originally a biology major with a minor in English when she came here to the State College of Teachers. This is an image from a biology field trip to the Pine Bush during that time. And though she swapped at one point and graduated with a cum laude with a minor in English in 1940. She received a broad liberal arts education, including English, French, math, music, Greek, and education. Though classes in hygiene and gym were not up to her usual standards, and she was actually excused from gym 2 out of 3 years, so these don't seem to be her strong points. And this is an image of the Page Hall Gym, which is in the basement of the downtown campus where the gym classes were. Now, because they were sort of this liberal arts school, and there was sort of that same type of ethos, but there was people who couldn't afford to go to an Ivy League school. They liked to feel like they were at an Ivy League school, so they established these traditions that they had to follow. So each class had a banner, and right at the last day of the year was moving up day, where you would go move to a different, from a freshman to a sophomore, or a sophomore to a junior. And before that day, you would have rivalry, which was when classes would challenge each other to athletic events. They had a mascot hunt where they had to hide a little sculpture mascot, and they had outlined literally the height, minimum, and maximum, so there must have been some cheating going on to how big these mascots were. And these are some of the traditions that were in place at that time. The Scania members, which was the sort of student, the head of the student body, they had to leave all the assembly hall first. Freshmen could not enter the front door of either Draper or Page halls at any point during their freshman year. When 2 students of a different rank went through a building at the same time, the upperclassmen had to go first. You couldn't cross the grass, and you had to hold a card that showed your class colors that identified which class you were in. And you had to, I think, College of the Empire State, I think, was a song that all the freshmen had to know how to sing. Now, if you didn't follow these traditions, there were real penalties. First of all, the first offense, you got a violation from Miss Scania, and the second offense, you actually had your name published in the student newspaper. The third offense, you had to stand up and make, in Page Hall, make a public apology to the student body. And your fourth offense, you got barred from the student office. And Marcia Brown actually was her sophomore year was the class reporter, but she wasn't the years afterwards. So I didn't see her name in the paper, but I do want to. In her sophomore year, Marcia joined Psi Gamma, which is a fraternity here on campus, and this is part of the initiation rituals for Psi Gamma.
Fraternity or sorority?
Sorority. Sorry. And she lived in this house on South Lake, which is about 2 blocks south of Washington Park, about a 10-minute walk from campus. Yet, I'm not sure if she really fit in with the sorority because that was her only year that she was listed as part of the sorority. Her junior year, she moved back into the alumni housing to this building called South Hall, which is around Thurlow Terrace area. And actually, her house mother during that period was none other than Anna Pierce, who had retired as Dean of Women a couple years previously. So she definitely got the in loco parentis experience while she was here. Her senior year, she lived in a private boarding house on South Main in New Scotland, which is quite a long distance away, about over a half-hour walk. So she might have taken the trolley here to campus. And she, as any student had during that time, she had to take a pledge that she was going to be a teacher after the school here. So her senior year, she actually taught 12th grade English at the Milne School on campus. And also during her time, she was really active in sort of student publications, as though she wasn't active in the sorority, but she seemed to move now to her publication work, and she was on the member of the State College Echo art staff, and the art editor of the State Lion, and the co-editor-in-chief of the Statesman, and this is some of her artwork on the cover of the Statesman. She was also on the business board of the State College News as well. And she also participated in theater a lot. She did a lot of the backgrounds, I believe, for the performances. And this is some more of her artwork from the State Lion, which we saw before. But that's the story of Marcia Brown at the State College of Teachers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's so interesting, Greg. All those rules for women, and there's virtually no rules for men. It's fascinating, but that's a topic for another day. So Marcia graduates with a degree in English, minor in drama, 1940. And as Greg said, if you were a student at the school at that time, you were required to sign a pledge, an oath, a literal signature that you were going to teach in the public schools in New York State. And so, they didn't really follow up on that, or they didn't enforce it and chase you around the rest of your life. But, probably for practical reasons, that's what Marcia did. She started to teach high school. She started teaching English at high school in Cornwall, New York, a few years. And she was studying in the summers also, even in college. She was studying down in Woodstock with a number of artists. Stuart Davis and Yasuo Kuniyoshi were someone that she studied with both in Woodstock. And finally, she decided that the upstate life of teaching high school was not for her. So she moved on down to New York City, and still with this drive to become an artist, to work in art or English or some type of field. And in 1943, she gets hired at the New York Public Library's Children's Division, which is the epicenter of children's book publishing at that time. If you got a good review by a New York public librarian, your book was going to sell nationally. So this was, it was very political, and really speaks to another topic for another day, the history of children's book publishing, and maybe some of you are going to talk about that today. So what we have today is Jeanne Lamb, who is the youth collections coordinator at the New York Public Library. And she's going to talk about what it was like in the 1940s to work in the children's division of the New York Public Library.
As you can imagine, this is 1943, and it is New York, and what is going on in the world that Marcia is living in at that time. It's the middle of World War II. And so in some cases, I think you could see that this was the beginning of Marcia starting to make very bold decisions about what it was that she would like to do. She was 25. She was going down to this very large city on her own. And she did, as Brian said, wind up being hired at the New York Public Library as an assistant, a library assistant. Now, in those days, Anne Carroll Moore would have been retired for a couple of years, and Frances Clark Sayers was the superintendent of work with children. Mary Gould Davis, renowned storyteller and folklorist in her own right, was still the superintendent of storytelling for children at the New York Public Library. So she would have been the person, Mary Gould Davis, who would have taken this brand new trainee intern under her wing, because that first year at New York Public Library, and if you're working in the children's department, what is happening is you are being trained by the really women who were immersed in the field of children's literature and library service to children. They were creating what library service to children would be. And they were examining and talking about what do children need and where did the public library fit into their lives and their needs. They were talking with educators, of course, we just heard from the School of Education, and that balance between the goals, of which are, of course, the same. We share those goals. It's to get the best out there to the children. So that first year, Marcia was working in the branches. She would have been going from one branch to another and conducting story times. That still happens today. That's your first year at the New York Public Library. And Mary Gould Davis must have noticed something in this young woman's repertoire as she took to the storytelling and her feel for the literature and the story times that she was helping to conduct for the children as they came into the neighborhood libraries. So within a year, Marcia was moved from the branches to the Central Children's Room. At that time, the Central Children's Room was at our 42nd Street location. And you can see this was the ideal. It's an old shot, I apologize, but I think you can get a sample of that concept of they wanted light, they wanted books all around, they wanted plenty of space so children could make themselves comfortable, and you can just make out some of the window seats there where children could curl up and read on their own if they wanted to. But this is the middle of the Second World War. The children's room was located on the ground floor of this building. Upstairs, on our third floor, in that magnificent, what is now called the Rose Reading Room, all the windows were painted black. They had been painted over for the blackout. In fact, the room itself would have been a little darker at this time. And there was that sense of darkness in the city. And there was rationing. So many children and families would come into the branches where there would be heat and light, and storytelling became one of those be comfortable, that space of the imagination and storytelling, and this is where Marcia excelled. Creating stories for children on her own. And one day when she was there, Frances Clark Sayers writes about this. Aunt Carol Moore had come back for a visit and read a story to the children. Peter Piper picked pickled peppers. Did Peter Piper pick a peck of pickled peppers? If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, where's the pick of pickled peppers that Peter Piper picked? Well, prior to Aunt Carol Moore, Caroline Hewins, another pioneer in children's services, used to go through this entire story, Peter Piper's Alphabet, which was first published back in the early 19th century, from memory. Aunt Carol Moore did not recite it from memory, but she did read it. And Marcia was so intrigued with this alphabet and the story that even though it was her first book that she published, she did go to this alphabet, and it is Peter Piper's Alphabet. She illustrated it, and you can still find this book in the circulating collection of the Central Children's Room at the New York Public Library. You want to think also of that time. Who were her colleagues? Who was she working with? Who was she meeting when she was working in there? And what was her job? Part of her job, again, you can see blackout times, things are very dark, was to set up exhibits and displays for the children in that children's room. So at that time also, the library was publishing a book each year, a little booklet of books that the librarians felt had special interest or but were potentially going to become classics in their own right. And it was called Children's Books. So those books, Marcia also would have been reading aloud during the children's story times in this children's room. Don't Count Your Chicks by Ingrid and Edgar Dolan. Caddy and the Big Snow, Virginia Lee Burton. Puppies for Keeps, Dorothy Lake. The Little Prince. Mary Poppins Opens the Door, that edition published that year by P.L. Travers. Three Gay Tales from Grimm, translated and illustrated by Wanda Gag. And the Jack Tales were published that year by Richard Chase. Think about it. This is what she's reading out loud, and she's not reading it one time. She's reading it over and over again, and the children are responding to these books and to these stories. She was absorbing this. This was becoming part of her DNA as an artist and as a storyteller. There was something else I noticed about that time period. That was her first year, by the way. All those books were published in 1943. Her first book was published in 1946, The Little Carousel. And guess what? The picture book section, the books are listed alphabetically by the author's last name. And Marcia's name started with B. So this began a tradition of her showing up as the first name listed. And we have The Little Carousel by Marcia Brown, Charles Scribner's Books, $1.50. The Penny Ride, a favorite in New York City streets, brings adventure to a small boy in this fresh and colorful picture picture storybook. That was the annotation. And I know you are going to really enjoy seeing the artwork related to her first book, which is out in the exhibition. I know you're going to enjoy seeing that. She had a colleague who also had a book in that year, and that would have been Cora Belpré. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with her work, but she was also a children's librarian at the New York Public Library at that time. And that was her book, The Tiger and the Rabbit and Other Tales. It was illustrated by Kay Peterson Parker, but also, who else was being published that year? What stories was she reading to the children during the Children's Story Hour? Raindrop Splash. It was by Alvin Trestle. Who was the illustrator? Leonard Wiseman. Pocahontas, the Dolaires are back again. Pretzel and the Puppies by Margaret and H.A. Ray. Folktales, another collection by Mary Gould Davis. Wakema and the Clayman and other African folktales. I wonder if some of the seeds weren't being planted right then and there for what was going to happen years later with Shadow. That was in 1946. She was still at New York Public Library. She was spending a lot of time painting down in that basement of the building, but also in her apartment. And 1947, Stone Soup. Who were her colleagues that she was sharing these distinctions with and still doing children's story times? Dr. Seuss, McElligot's Pool. More Tales from Grimm. Wanda Gag is back. The Cowtail Switch and other West African stories. Porlander, the wonderful, wonderful Porlander. And the Song of Robin Hood, illustrated, Virginia Lee is back, by Virginia Lee Burton. The next year, she's still there. Blueberries for Sal by Robert McCluskey. Johnny Maple Leaf. Alvin is back with Roger Duvazan this time. Juanita by Leah Pilotti. Fish in the Air by Kurt Wise. The Dolaires are back. And Barbara Cooney has illustrated Sally Tate by Frances Clark Sayers, her boss. So she was not just working in the library, she was absorbing what was going on at this time with her colleagues. She worked, these were the children's librarians who were doing the writing and the collecting of the folklore and the storytelling, because it was also part of their everyday work. In 1949, she's just left. She's going to try it, going out on her own, because we can tell now that there's going to be a lot of success. Her artwork, it's not just a passing fancy. This is who she is at this point in her life. Henry Fisherman, A Story of the Virgin Islands, another Caldecott Honor. Who was she working with and talking with and visiting with? The Happy Day by Ruth Krauss, illustrated by Mark Simone. Two Little Trains by Margaret Wise Brown. Sun Up, there's Alvin that's left again, illustrated by Roger Duvazan. When you think about this, and I was looking at who she was spending time with, it looks like 1916, the year she was born, was a pretty good year for children's storytellers and illustrators in the up-and-coming generation that she was part of. Mark Simone was born in 1915. Barbara Cooney, 1917. Robert McCluskey, 1914. Alvin Trestle, 1916. Leonard Weisgard, 1916. It really jumped out at me that this was a whole generation of people that were in New York, spending time together, and picking up with a generation immediately prior. Our James Thurber's, our Robert Frost's, these are the books that children are reading at that time. The Rays, Cora Belpre, Harold Forlander. They were from that generation immediately prior to where Marcia was with her colleagues, her contemporaries at that time. So I think you can see that she had a lot of support for what it was when she was making this decision. It was life-altering to leave the day job. And it is something that people are faced with today. This is something that we can all relate to. When, those choices that you make of what you're going to do with life. With, Ezra Jack Keats, born 1960 as well. These were her contemporaries and her colleagues. And Marcia said, the ideas and images gathered by children from their books are like lotus seeds, endlessly reborn to bloom in successive seasons of their lives. So here's the Children's Center today. You can see the windows, the light. It's changed a little bit, but there's so many things that are the same as when Marcia was there. Her publisher, Scribner, that became Atheneum, that is now Simon & Schuster, still has. It's not a great shot, but you can see they honor her works on their wall of all of their award winners. They call it the Marcia Brown Wall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was wonderful. It's clear that Marcia gained some invaluable experience at New York Public Library, introduced to their international collections, a diverse clientele. I mean, really, when you think about it, it's her graduate school, right? It's where she learned techniques to draw, methods to draw, but she went and got that education in the content at New York Public. And as you said, this really kicks off the beginning of more than 4 decades of a prolific career, illustrating books, publishing children's books, translating books. I mean, if you're thinking about, if she were a baseball player, you'd be using her name, with like Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio and Babe Ruth. I mean, that's what she does from 1946. She publishes Little Carousel, that first book. And you look at it, right? 46 is the first book. Then you get 47, Caldecott Honor Book. 49, Caldecott Honor Book. 50, Caldecott Honor Book. 51. They must have got sick of her by the late 50s, right? All of these, every book besides her 1982 Caldecott, either an honor book or a Caldecott Award, happens between 46 and 54. Amazing, just cranking them out. So we're going to hear more about these books, but I want to change course just a little bit and treat this like you're at the orchestra. So in between speakers, get up, fill up your iced tea, have a cookie, have a brownie. Okay, feel free to get up in between and fill yourself and get the legs going. But I want to change directions a little bit, right? So Marcia has this prolific career publishing. She eventually moves out of New York City and buys some land out in West Reading, Connecticut. and meets a number of people out there. And again, continuing working, continuing publishing, but doing some things, what was she doing on the side? What was she doing for fun, right? She wasn't writing and publishing and illustrating all the time. So we're gonna hear from a neighbor of Marcia's, Jeanne Solum. Jeanne Solum is an internationally known classic flute soloist, has played at some amazing places around the world, but he was also Marcia's friend and Marcia's flute teacher. And so we're going to bring Jeanne Solum up here, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the personal Marcia.
I'm very honored to be asked to say a few words at this special event honoring dear Marcia Brown. I'm a professional musician, as Brian said, a flutist. I am not a librarian, nor a specialist in book illustration or book publishing, nor am I an artist. However, it was as a flutist that I met Marcia Brown. Living about 20 minutes away from each other, she in West Reading, Connecticut, and myself in Westport, she contacted me about taking flute lessons. She indeed played the flute as an amateur. I use the French meaning of the term, for the love of, amateur. I accepted her, and I think this was about 1980. Together, we worked once a week in my studio. She was frankly not a virtuoso player, and so I avoided the difficult works by composers like Prokofiev. However, there are hundreds of less challenging works for flute, and that is where she progressed. During the winter months, she and her partner, Janet, fled the snow and ice of Connecticut to a retirement community in Southern California. But we kept in close touch, and I encouraged her to keep practicing. Our friendship deepened. We discovered many similar interests in the arts: visual art, drama, dance. Her lessons with me grew from 1 hour to 2 hours in length. The extra hour evolved into a delightful conversation period about our mutual artistic interests. I discovered that Marcia was not a gossiper. She loathed gossip. She was a woman of ideas, ideas expressed through the arts. This is the essence of her greatness, and she conveyed this through her writing and her illustrations. She had a natural curiosity about everything. She was like a sponge, soaking up new ideas and fresh experiences. For her, education was a lifelong journey, not just here. She traveled widely, and even in her later years, she made numerous trips to China to explore that great culture, to savor their sublime art, and to learn to speak and read Chinese. She was fascinated by the calligraphy of Chinese writing, since each character is itself a visual experience, indeed a work of art. One especially happy experience with Marcia and Janet, for me, was the selling of their house in West Reading and my good luck in finding a buyer. Because of the cold Connecticut winters, they decided to move permanently on a full-time basis to their condos in California at Laguna Woods. near San Juan Capistrano. The house in West Reading was in poor condition, and I know that real estate agents would have required expensive and time-consuming improvements before they would even consider putting it on the market. The house is located on the top of a rocky promontory on the edge of a magnificent protected forest in the picturesque town of West Reading, about a mile from the house of the legendary composer Charles Ives. However, it just so happens that I had another flute pupil, Richard Whiten, whose wife was great with child. They lived in a beach cottage in a Connecticut coastal town. And the public school where they taught music was only about a 20-minute drive from Marcia and Janet's house. It would have been impractical to continue living in their coastal town. So I made the match. Richard was undaunted by the poor condition of the house. He had the skills and imagination to remodel the interior of the house. In 1 week, Barbara and Richard, he's a SUNY Albany graduate, by the way, they sold their beach property, bought Marcia and Janet's home in West Reading, and had the baby. Richard and Barbara are here with you. Everything happened according to plan, and it was like a miracle. I was delighted to be the go-between. Marcia was not one to waste time organizing her life's possessions. Creative people like to be creative. So her studio in the house was a mess, filled with piles of papers and drawings and books. But, she said to me, I know where everything is. So one day, a truck appeared, and the piles of papers and artwork were loaded into the truck, and off it all went to this library. They have people who can organize it all, Marcia said to me. I should tell you, however, that I did get a little reward for my efforts. Marcia had a Volkswagen Golf with only 5,000 miles on it. It was not possible for them to drive it all the way to California. So she gave it to me. It was never discussed as such, but I'm sure this was my commission for having been the successful go-between in the sale of that house. I drove that car for another 170,000. And when I finally traded it in for a new car, I told Marcia that I thought of her every mile of the way. I really appreciated that gift. Now, over the years, Marcia generously gave me artworks in addition to the car, and I'd like to show some of them to you. She also gave me photographs that I needed for a book I was publishing, and she made a poster for a music festival that actually Richard Whiten and I ran, the Connecticut Early Music Festival. So if you'll let me show you these items. This is the poster she did for the Connecticut Early Music Festival. It was the 11th season. And it was done in cut paper, cut and pasted papers. And you see here a bugle player on the bow of a ship with birds and fish. Now this is an extra copy, and if this library, as my gift to the book I was telling you about, I wrote for Oxford University Press. It's in my field. It's called The Early Flute, and I needed some photographs. So I'm not a photographer, but Marcia had the camera to do some close-ups. And so here is a page with some close-up photographs of keys on an old flute. And I talk about them in the text, but there are her photographs. And each picture says, photo courtesy of Marcia Brown. And then here is another photograph here that she took for my book. So she helped me out of the problem there. She studied Chinese calligraphy, and there was a year when it was the year of the tiger, and I went to Princeton, where we have the tiger is our animal. And so she did a tiger in Chinese. And you almost feel the energy of the tiger. Now, there's a little story about this. I sent one of these to the Princeton Alumni Weekly and suggested that they should put it on the front cover, which they did. So it went out to 40 or 50,000 Princeton graduates, courtesy of Marcia Brown. This is an example of her calligraphy that is art. A couple, these were birthday cards.
Oh, wow.
This was on my 50th birthday. Happy birthday with much love, Marcia. May the next 50 be filled with joy. She wrote on the back. Here's another one, another birthday. This is another one. This is another birthday card. And this is another beautiful birthday card. And here's another one with a frog jumping into water. And then, at about the same time she did shadow, she got into cut and pasted papers. So she gave me a couple of original ones, which I have matted. They are abstract. Here's one. And here's another. And then, towards the end of her life, she would wake up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep. And she would sit on the edge of the bed with a piece of paper in her lap, and she would make abstract watercolors. And then she would put them into books and send them to friends, like this. And I have about 15 or so of these books with her little decorations, her abstractions. And a couple of them I have matted. And here's what they look like when they're matted. They are indeed works of art. So, that's my experience with Marcia Brown, and I appreciate your inviting me to speak here.
Okay. So it's good. Took my advice. I'm very happy about that. I actually have a lot of those similar things that Marcia has sent to me over the last 15 years or so. She was also sent a lot of things to my 8-year-old daughter. So great stuff. Thank you, John. And I want to talk about that studio in California a little bit, where myself and somebody else in the room went through all of her paintings and artwork from the last 30 years to pack it up to come here. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But before we start to talk about packing up that collection, you alluded to loading things into a truck. Well, John, it's not so easy. It's not so easy. There was a lot of stuff to load in that truck, right? 40 years worth of original artwork that went into all of her books. Marcia kept everything that went into the various drafts of artwork that eventually, and we have stuff on exhibit. The exhibit's really going to be wonderful. A couple of people talked about it, where you could trace that first draft to that final artwork draft. So I want to bring up now my predecessor as head of special collections and archives. Really awesome to have Dorothy Christensen here. Taught me a lot, made my job a little bit easier. And she was the person who went to West Reading, Connecticut, with a couple of other folks, I imagine, and spent some time there meticulously packing up all of that material. But Richard, I have a question for you, sir.
Yes.
Have you looked behind the walls? Did she hide anything? I start cutting those walls open. There's something in there, I think.
There really isn't so much, but there are a few things that sort of appeared behind shelves.
Yeah.
Some nice little sketches.
Really interesting.
Recognizable.
And a class of 1978. And if you're in the exhibition, Richard's pictures in the yearbook. So you can see Richard in 1978. It's there. I looked at it, I scanned it, and sent it to him. But without any further delay, I introduce Dorothy Christensen to tell us about her experience with me.
Hi. Many people have asked why we collected Marcia Brown's materials, why we went after her paperwork. In the late 1980s, the University at Albany's Special Collections and Archives Department began a project of soliciting the papers or the collections of notable authors who had graduated from this institution. Among those were Pulitzer Prize winner William Kennedy, historian and biographer Joseph Persico, who did biographies for, among others, Edward R. Murrow, Colin Powell. He did a piece on Nelson Rockefeller. He also did work on the Nuremberg trials and FDR. And then there was Marcia Brown, internationally renowned illustrator and author of children's books, and the only 3-time Caldecott Award winner for the American Libraries Association's highest award for excellence in children's picture book illustrations. and as has been mentioned already, 6 of her books were designated as Caldecott Honor Books. Marcia was originally contacted in 1987, before I was in the department but still had responsibility for the department. She was contacted by library faculty member Ann Roberts and was asked about donating her collection to the University Libraries Special Collections and Archives Department. It would make a wonderful addition or complement to the Miriam Snow Mathis Historical Children's Literature Collection. Marcia told Ann that her collection included sketches, manuscripts, working drafts of books, book dummies, woodcuts, puppet theaters, puppets. You name it, it was in there. She made her initial donation in 1987 or 1988, and it was 12 cubic feet of material, and the material was placed in storage and nothing was done with it because we knew more that was probably going to be coming. As with every collection that comes into the university's archives and special collections department, there is a memorandum of agreement. In layman's terms, a contract, a legal contract between the donor and the institution. And in that contract, it details the scope of the collection, what we'd be collecting, and what our responsibilities were for that collection, including processing it. It addressed issues of copyright, and it addressed issues of access. And in many institutions, you have collections that nobody can get at the papers because they're restricted access. In fact, just for example, we've got the German Intellectual Emigre Collection, which has since changed its name, and I don't remember what it is. But it was the German Intellectual Emigre Collection, and we had people coming from Europe, from Germany, to use the papers here because even though there were parts of those collections in repositories in Germany, they were not allowed to look at them. So again, it was a really good research collection, but not accessible overseas, but accessible here. So we always push to have our collections accessible to the public. Okay. Marcia signed her memorandum of agreement in April 1990. I became head of special collections due to a personnel shift. My predecessor, Don Skemmer, left and went to University of Princeton University to be the head of archives there. One of my first objectives was to go through all the memorandum of agreements and find out what the status was, get in contact with the donors, see if we needed to follow up with anybody who was already set, did they have any more information they wanted to donate to us or any more materials to donate to us. Prior to contacting Marcia, as I did with a lot of the donors, I did some research. As was mentioned today, I found out she was a New York State alum. For the New York State College for Teachers? Yes. I'm asking Jeff Williams there in the back, because I used to say New York State College of Teachers. It's for, yes. And she worked on the State Line and the Statesman. And she was an art editor, she was a regular editor, she was a contributor, she did poetry. And many of us think that the nascent beginning of her artistic career began here at the University at Albany, or its predecessor institution. We do have pictures, I think during one of the presentations, of the mice and the lions and all that stuff that she had put into the Statesman and the State Line. Yes, I'm just remembering the names. Marcia's former career as a children's author illustrator began in 1946 with the publication of Little Carousel. What struck me most when I was doing research on her was that not only was she a 3-time Caldecott winner, the only one, it spanned 4 decades. And the first book was done in gouache, pen, and ink. The second one, that was Cinderella and the Little Glass Slipper, also a translation. That's why she's called a translator as well as an artist and illustrator. And the second one, Once a Mouse, was done in woodcuts with earth tone colors. Cinderella, pastels, very light and airy. Once a Mouse, woodcuts, earth tone. And then her last one in 1982, was Shadow. That had heavy, dark, rich, washed backgrounds with stark silhouette figures cut in paper and pasted on the pages. Very different style, something quite unusual with a lot of authors and illustrators. Most of them pick a style and it's pretty much the same throughout their career. She matched her artwork with the story. Very important to her. In early 1992, I also learned at that time that her publications were translated into Japanese, Chinese, Afrikaans, Hoshi, which is a Bantu language, and Spanish. And during my career with Marcia, working with Marcia, I also met Mr. Ito, who ran the Book Load Company in Japan. And some of us were chuckling about Mr. Ito, but Mr. Ito won, Mr. Ito got. But he also published her books over in Japan and had her internationally known. Early in 1992, I contacted Marcia, introduced her to me in my new role, and started a wonderful working relation and friendship with Marcia Brown. As I indicated, she told me she was moving to Laguna. At that time, it was the Laguna Woods, and then it got changed to Laguna Hills, although she was still living in the same place. I think there was some redistricting or something going on. But she met me at her home in West Reading, Connecticut. I drove that truck. I packed that truck. Marcia, luckily, thank God, when John said about what her collection looked like, I didn't see it like that. By the time I got there, she had hired some students and they had worked with her and they packed it all. No rhyme, no reason, but they packed it all. So all we had to do was get it into the truck. I went with Mary Oshelsky, so us two young ladies went out there, and luckily the young men that she had helping her pack things also helped us load the truck. I've always said that it was like going to visit one of my aunts. I'd never met her in person, but it was such a warm, welcoming feeling to walk into her house and be there as a friend, as a colleague, as a niece. It was a strange, strange feeling, but it was wonderful. And that kind of feeling has continued all the way through our working together over the years. We picked up 70 cubic feet of material. Big boxes, small boxes, paper bags, handbags, cartons, shopping bags, you name it, it went into the truck. We got it here and went, oh my God, now what do we do? In December 1994, we knew we had to find money to process the collection. We did not have extra money at that time for processing a special collection of this nature. In 1994, Marcia called me and said, you know, I realize how much trouble it is going to be to process that collection. Would $5,000 help? I was on my sofa with 102 temperature in the middle of having pneumonia. And I was calm and I said, yes, that would be wonderful. I'm talking to Mary Jo Dougherty, director of the Art Museum, about possibly putting on an exhibit of Marcia Brown's work with a conference on folklore and fairy tales and children's literature, because that's what Marcia emphasized in her work. And she said, oh, how about 10,000? The next day I called the director of libraries and said, I don't think I was hallucinating, but I think we're going to get a check for $10,000 from Marcia to start processing this collection. And Marcia's the check did come in, by the way. I wasn't hallucinating. Marcia did continue over the succeeding years of providing us funding to support the processing of her collection, to put towards helping with the this collection, to put towards helping with the production of the exhibit and the conference. As of April 2001, it was $75,000. And I understand that more has come since. Brian was saying something about getting a Christmas card with a $15,000 check in it. That was usually the way the money came.
Best Christmas card I ever got.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, your name was not on the check. Most of our manuscript collections consist of I'm going back to the old days when I was still here. They consist of manuscripts, books, recordings, and some videos. Marcia's collection, her life work, presented major organization and storage challenges. In addition to the normal manuscripts, books, dummies, sketchbooks, drawings, she had wood blocks with wood cuts, linoleum blocks for printing, galleys, press sheets, oversized vinyl art, puppets, a puppet theater. It was an amazing collection of materials. How do you organize and how do you store that? In total, well, I'll skip that part first. The materials the collection, we decided for the sake of space preservation and the safety of the materials, we would store like things together. So all the woodcuts got stored together. All the final art got stored by book, but within the same boxes. And even though we did it that way, we always had the acid-free tissue paper between each piece so that it was protected. Everybody wore white cotton gloves so that we didn't smear anything, because we were handling the final work that she put into her books. And she was really, and some of it's amazing. When you go into the research room, you'll see the little carousel and you'll see the color separation sheets that she had to do for the black color and for the yellow color. And if you look at the final art, she also did one for red and she also did one for green. We had them all in the collection. So we stored it by type of material. And even with that, we have over 180 boxes worth of material from Marcia Brown, documenting her entire career. So you got all this work, got it all organized. How do you find it? Well, we had Kevin Blick, who was a student assistant who worked for us on that, specifically on this collection. And he organized it after we discussed it. You know, you do it by manuscript and then you do it by woodcuts and then you do it, no, let's do it by title of the book. So we went through every book and gathered the sketchbooks, the early manuscripts, the book dummies, the final art, the color separations, the press sheets, the publicity, anything that related to that book in the paper finding aid, which now, thanks to Mark, is on Mark Wolf. It's online. And it was an index to where you find which item in which box. So you go and you look up little carousel, I want to see the black color separation, it's in box number so-and-so, which is on shelf number such and such. So we had the whole collection organized and therefore easily accessible, which made it really great when you're going to put together a class for somebody. One of the best classes I ever did with the Marcia Brown collection, in addition to doing library school classes and education school classes, was a first grade elementary school class for Windermere Elementary School. It was fantastic. And we talked about things like the style of the glass slipper versus the style of shadow. What do you see, kids, that's different between these two drawings? That one's got a lot more white in it. It feels airy. Great. I mean, these kids were wonderful about picking up on things like this. And it was one of the best classes. Maybe because I like little kids. Anyway, we have over 30 books produced in Marcia's career. In that finding aid, we also identified over 460 final pieces of art. Every page for every book, or almost every. A few pieces escaped because she gave presents to people before we got, before we got the final collection. In May of 1996, Marcia received the University of Albany's highest honor, an honorary degree. While at the university, I had the privilege of doing an hour-long interview with her about her career, and we thanked the Schenectady OTB, which provided the studio and the cinematographer. I sent her 5 questions in advance of the interview. Some of the questions included, what books influenced you as a child? How do you match the material with your artistic style, or reverse, how do you match your artistic style with the material? And what impact does the digital age have on children's storybooks? There were 2 other questions. If you go online, you can see the entire interview. Again, it's on the website for Marcia Brown, or the Marcia Brown page as they call it. Once the finding aid, she also did a speech at the honorary doctorate acceptance, and that interview is, again, online. Once we had the finding aid for the Marcia Brown papers, we could locate the items in the boxes. So I met with Karina Shamming, who's the assistant director for the University of Art Museum, and she and I started the project of co-curating a collection called Once Upon a Drawing, the picture book illustrations of Marcia Brown. We went through and tried to match Marcia's theme. And her theme statement for this, at the time that this was being done and we wanted to put it in the art museum, there was a conflict going on about whether or not illustration was art and whether or not the art museum should have an illustrator's works displayed. Marcia had a theme statement for the opening of this exhibit, and it was posted on the wall. Many people have confounded the aims and methods of illustration with those of fine art, which has its origins in an entirely different level of the unconscious. They forget that a book starts with an idea, whether or not it has text, and illustration is at its service. Successful illustration extends, embellishes, illuminates, but never obliterates the idea. I'm happy to say that in the exhibit we highlighted 14 of Marcia's works. We had over 121 pieces, both framed final work, color separations. We had wood cuts, we had linoleum cuts, we had matching the wood cut and the linoleum cut to the actual print, to the actual final copy. We also had her puppet theater and her puppets. And I don't know if I should tell you this, but the puppets were nicely propped on Sam Adams beer bottles. They worked perfectly. Nobody knew that until after it was all over, but they were empty, by the way. The variety of materials presented in Once Upon a Drawing highlighted the spontaneous inspiration, the sustained vision, and the exacting discipline Marcia brought to the art of illustrating books for children. An in-depth study of her work reveals that it is, at its root, is a boundless affinity for the drawn line, hence the title Once Upon a Drawing. While developing the exhibit, I also worked with David Mitchell, acting curator of the Grenada Department's Miriam Snow Mathis Historical Literature, Children's Literature Collection, and other university faculty members to develop a companion conference entitled Once Upon a Time, Folklore and Fairy Tales in Children's Literature. Again, emphasizing Marcia's focus for her artwork and for her books. Despite that program started with a dinner on March 14th, 1997. And in spite of a sleet storm, a really bad sleet storm, we still managed to have a wonderful dinner in the campus center. And Karen Hitchcock, president of the university at that time, came and did the opening speech. I think I said something, if Karen doesn't show up, I wrote the speech so I can give it, but we're having the dinner because Marcia's here. The interesting thing about the dinner was the menu. In addition to the fun time that we had. The menu started with stone soup. And in the bottom of every bowl were a couple of stones that had been carefully cleaned by Mary Jo Dougherty, director of the Art Museum. She also had on the menu some meat dish that referenced hippopotamus meat. And I think that was in reference to Marcia's book, How Hippo. But we played on the theme throughout. It was a fun dinner. And at least half the people managed to get there. The next day, there was a full turnout. We had a wonderful program. Let's see. In that program, Marcia addressed one of the overarching themes of her work. Big dreams, big themes, big quests, big joys, stretched souls. She was very adamant every time I talked to her. She was trying to stretch the kids' imaginations, the kids' imagery, the kids' ability to think, the kids' ability to be a little scared and then come back to the final moral of the story, which worked out fine. Like, one of the things that happened in the exhibit is we had a picture of this. This is Marcia's last book, How the Ostrich Got Its Long Neck. Here we have the ostrich with the short neck being grabbed by the alligator. My co-curator didn't want to have this in the exhibit because it's too violent. I won. It was in the exhibit. The kids loved it. And they loved the fact that the next picture in the exhibit was the ostrich with the long neck, and he can reach the ground easier and eat much better. So it was a really fascinating time for me working with Marcia over these years. When we finished the the conference, we had the opening exhibition that evening. A lot of the, quote, artists from the region did show up, and Cinderella and Joanne in a mouse outfit was there, and we had great time. The kids loved it. They really enjoyed everything. We had public programs running from March through April of 1997, all relating to the exhibit. There were pictures, or excuse me, a program for little kids in the art museum on how to make your own picture book. There were stories from the Mathis collection. There were stories from, or presentations from people in the education department, all different aspects that related to Marcia's career. Or after she finished with How the Ostrich Got His Long Neck, she did start focusing more on her Chinese painting. And she did provide to the university libraries a large number of her Chinese illustrations, which we had framed and mounted in the research room. I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but as a friend, she also gave me a beautiful Chinese picture painting called The Sound of the Waterfall. And it's nicely framed, and I do have a letter gifting it to me as a friend, just so that we know that I didn't take it home. And someday, Brian, it'll probably come back to the collection. I won't know about it, I'll be gone by then, because it's not leaving me before then. In addition, she also gave us an extensive collection of East Asian art books, many of which were never available outside of East Asia. So this collection was contributed to the university libraries and has become a research collection for art students as well as historians and others interested in East Asian culture. Since receiving Marcia Brown's paper, her work has been lent for exhibit to the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto. Would you like to guess which book was emphasized? Little Glass Slipper? Bata Shoe Museum? It was the prince putting the slipper on Cinderella's foot. That also went on a traveling exhibit, including the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. In 2001, 29 of her illustrations from Hans Christian Andersen works, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, Wild Swans, and The Snow Queen, were loaned to Media Links, a Japanese company, which mounted a traveling exhibit in honor of Hans Christian Andersen's 500th birthday. Brian, I'm sure, can tell you if other things have been exhibited since 2001. I don't know. I presume they have. It's nice when you've got a well-framed collection and you don't have to do much except pack it carefully and send it out under a contract. In 2000, I was going to retire, I knew that, and I proposed that the University Libraries Administration and the Office of Development get together and name the University Library's Special Collections and Archives Research Room in honor of Marcia Brown. She had given us so much as far as the collection, financial support, and intellectual support. The University Council voted unanimously to name the M.E. Bernander Department of Special Collections and Archives Research Room in honor of Marcia's intellectual and financial support to the university and the university libraries. On November 2nd, 2001, the Marcia Brown Research Room was officially designated. She was unable to be here because of her health, but we did send her a videotape of the program and of how we stored her collection in the Bernander Department's humidity and temperature controlled storage area, which is right behind the research room. My work with Marcia and her collections has been an absolute highlight of my career. I thought it was the Emigre collection, but it was really the Marcia Brown collection. I'm pleased that my friendship with her continued long after my retiring from the university. By the way, after the presentation, 2 weeks later, I retired. I had done my job and gotten the room named for her. When I retired, she also kept in contact with me, and I also, like John and like Brian, have received some of her lovely little portfolios. Mine are mostly abstracts, and it's a combination of photos and original art. They too, at some point in time, will come back to the Marcia Brown papers, Marcia J. Brown papers here at the University at Albany. My other joy in dealing with the Marcia Brown papers was having her present me with books across the years. I have nieces and nephews. I don't want to give it to them because they're signed. And every once in a while I just go through and I read what she says about, our friendship and stuff. And I'm just absolutely delighted that you came here to honor her. Her passing is a loss, but her presence was one of the best gifts she could ever give to the children's literature world. Thank you.
Almost made you collide. That's the oldest book. It happens. Marcia Brown. Okay. Dorothy said that books came in as well, art books and that, but also there were children picked out, and there are about 80 now in the
Available now for just a few cents. All children should therefore learn to keep their noses and mouths clean. It goes on and on. Boys may think it is manly to imitate some old workman they have seen and blow their noses with their fingers. These boys evidently do not know that if handkerchiefs had been as cheap and plentiful when those men were young as they are now, the men would never have gotten into habits which shock people now because they are neither clean nor nice. But you can really see meditations on something that's, you know, so ordinary, so everyday, that does not receive lots of press in other forms, but here in children's books gets lots of attention. So I was really excited to figure out, now I need to look at more and more books to find handkerchiefs. And children's literature is really key. If you want to be thinking about some of these habits and practices, I'm hoping now to look at tracking the eventual disappearance of handkerchiefs in children's literature as new practices are coming into play. And children's literature is so key to developing attitudes and values that affect behavior that, you know, these lessons about handkerchiefs stick with people. A second element of children's literature that I think can make it really useful for historians is that it so explicitly demonstrates and conveys cultural values and beliefs. And so whether it's the presence or absence of people of color, or the kinds of work that people are tasked with carrying out can really send important lessons about gender and race. But it's not just those kinds of social mores. A historian named Francesca Ammon has used children's books to highlight the ways in which there's a spate of bulldozer books between about 1940 and 1960. I can tell you as a mother of two boys, bulldozer books remain an important and significant theme. But these books reflected the grand remaking of the nation as interstate highways displaced woods and wetlands and slum clearance demolished urban neighborhoods. But these bulldozer books published in the 1940s and 50s reflects little of the critique of the grand rebuilding that would come by the 1960s and 1970s as environmentalists decried the loss of habitat and social activists like Jane Jacobs worried about the effects of this reconstruction on the fabric of American cities. Rather, the book celebrated progress brought about by modern technology and softened the dramatic destruction by depicting both bulldozer drivers and the machinery itself in friendly and non-threatening terms. Here we see Virginia Lee Burton, which I know is one of the, right around the time, right, of Marcia Brown's time in the New York Public Library. So sometimes it can be difficult when I'm explaining to students. They see these grand problems and they wonder, what were they thinking? How did they get in such a mess? And so sometimes I think children's books can help them to understand the worldview, understand the cultural conceptions that might have thought some of the things in the past were beneficial at the time. And clearly I'm not trying to argue here that children's books were the great source of all ills, but rather, there's federal policy and economic effects. But for understanding the character of the time, understanding the frame of reference, students can really get a better sense of that sometimes through children's books. And I also, finally, I think it's really one of the significant ways in which children's books can serve as a primary source is that they are fodder through which students can explore a wide-ranging set of topics about the past. And so although my interests are in early 20th century environmental history of public health, and you saw that reflected in the ways in which I'm employing children's books, one of the great things about the vast diversity of the collection and the vast diversity of themes in which children's authors engaged is that students with great interests in a variety of things can still use this collection. A number of years ago, not too long, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I had a student in a seminar class, and I knew of this great collection, and so I was excited to tell students about it. He was interested in Russian history, and was studying Russian, but didn't yet have the language skills to study documents in Russian. And so he was trying to figure out a way that he could sort of triangulate his interest in Russian history with the sources at hand. And so he went to the Mathis collection, and he found a whole host of literature that had been published, and he was interested in sort of the portrayal of Russian radicals at the time. And so his footnotes included things like Petrinka, the story of a Russian child, and he wrote this fabulous essay about Anglo-American children's books and how they portrayed Russian revolutionaries in the late 19th and early 20th century. Went on to, now he's an MA student at Oxford. So there are ways in which Marcia Brown's legacy lives on at this institution, not always through just in the past and remembering what New Albany or the State College for Teachers was like in the late 30s or early 40s, but also through the ways in which she supported the collections and inspired this writing and artwork and history to be conserved. Therefore, serving as fodder for other scholars to continue to think differently and to perhaps be able to foster the same kinds of curiosity with which it sounds she treated the world. So it's been a great treat to learn more about her, and I hope to continue to use this collection as a way to help foster learning at this institution. Thank you.
Before I bring out our keynote speaker today, Anita Silvey, I do want to announce something that's recently come to our attention. One of the things that's flown about today, sort of the themes that's going on today, is Marcia's generosity, donating her collection, donating money to support the development of the collection, development of the department. And it's a good example of a graduate supporting her institution where really she began the development of her skills and knowledge as a writer. So I'm happy to announce today that in Marcia's will, all of the royalties from her book